The wedding dress lay abandoned on the bed, its delicate lace contrasting with the urgency of the moment. Clara Thompson adjusted her horse's reins as she watched the dust storm approaching the Wyoming horizon. His heart was beating fast, not because of the prospect of the marriage he had just abandoned, but because of the lonely figure he had seen lying on the plains a few minutes ago. The 22-year-old had grown up under the strict expectations of society in Riverbrook, a prosperous trading town in Wyoming Territory. As the daughter of the local doctor, Dr. William Thompson, she was expected to marry Howard Mitchell, the arrogant son of the banker who controlled half the area's businesses. The arranged marriage promised to unite two of the city's most important families, but Clara had always known that her destiny would be different. That morning, as her guests helped her with the final preparations, Clara watched from the second-story window of the Thompson mansion as a lone horseman fell from his mount on the distant plains. Without hesitation, she changed from her wedding dress to her riding clothes and escaped through the back of the house, taking with her her bag of medical equipment, a gift from her father, who had always supported her interest in medicine, even when others considered it unladylike. Now, galloping against the wind, Clara could better distinguish the fallen figure. He was a man of strong build, dressed differently from the locals. His heart sank as he noticed the bloodstains that spread across the ground around him. Quickly dismounting, Clara knelt beside the stranger. His features were striking, his sun-tanned skin and long black hair indicative of his Native American heritage. A deep wound on his left side was still bleeding, and his breathing was shallow. "Can you hear me?" Clara asked, checking his vitals with the experience gained helping her father at the clinic. The man slowly opened his eyes, revealing a piercing gaze that made her catch her breath. For a moment, they remained like that, immersed in a silence full of meaning. "My name is Clara," she said softly, starting to clean the wound. "I'll take care of you." The stranger watched her intensely, but didn't say a word. Clara worked methodically, cleaning and stitching the wound with the skill her father had secretly taught her. The hours passed as she cared for him, ignoring thoughts of the chaos his absence must have caused in the city. As the sun began to set, turning the sky orange, Clara realized that she couldn't leave him there. A few kilometers away was an abandoned cabin that she had discovered on her solitary rides. It would be the perfect getaway. With difficulty, she managed to help him onto his horse, and together they made the journey to the hut. The man hadn't spoken yet, but his eyes never left hers, as if he were trying to decipher a mystery. In the dusty cabin, Clara improvised a bed with old blankets she found. While lighting a small fire, he finally heard his voice, deep and melodious. "Eagle Shadow," he said simply, bringing his hand to his chest. Clara smiled, understanding that he was revealing her name. "Eagle Shadow," she repeated softly. In the weeks that followed, Clara divided her time between secret visits to the cabin and calculated appearances in town, where her family was devastated by her hysterical behavior on her wedding day. Howard Mitchell, humiliated, swore revenge as evil whispers spread through the halls of Riverbrook. Eagle Shadow was recovering quickly under his care. Little by little they began to communicate through gestures and single words, creating their own language. Clara discovered that he understood English better than he spoke it, and each day brought a new discovery about her mysterious patient. What she didn't know was that Eagle Shadow was no ordinary warrior. As chief of the Lakota tribe, his absence had already been noticed, and his warriors searched tirelessly for him. I also didn't imagine that every look exchanged, every accidental touch during dressings, every smile shared, was weaving a bond that would defy the laws of both worlds. One afternoon, while changing the bandages, Clara felt Eagle Shadow's strong hand gently hold her wrist. Their eyes met, and in that moment, she knew that her life would never be the same. His touch sent waves of heat through her body, awakening feelings she had never experienced with Howard or any other man. On the horizon, clouds of dust announced the approach of horsemen. The time of secrets was coming to an end, and with it, the life Clara knew would be changed forever. Eagle Shadow also saw them, and his countenance changed. He knew it was time to reveal his true identity, and that this revelation would change their fates irrevocably. The sun was setting over the Wyoming horizon, painting the sky with dramatic colors that seemed to foreshadow the turbulence to come. Clara Thompson, the young woman who dared to defy the conventions of her society, was about to discover that her act of compassion would take her on a journey far beyond the confines of Riverbrook, to a world where love and loyalty would be tested in the forges of prejudice and tradition. The arrival of the Lakota warriors at the abandoned cabin transformed the peaceful afternoon into a moment of palpable tension. Clara watched, transfixed, as 6 imposing men dismounted their horses, their expressions a mixture of relief and suspicion at the sight of Eagle Shadow. The oldest among them, a gray-haired warrior with a weathered face, stepped forward and addressed Eagle Shadow in his native tongue. To Clara's surprise, her patient responded with an authority she had never noticed before. His posture changed completely. He was no longer the wounded and vulnerable man she had known, but someone who exuded natural power and command. "Clara?" Eagle Shadow turned to her, his voice firmer than ever. "I need you to come with us." The young woman felt her heart accelerate. "Where to?" "My village. It's not safe for you to go back to Riverbrook now." He paused, his dark eyes fixed on hers. "Howard Mitchell and his men have been looking for you. They found out about our meetings." The icy fear that ran down her spine wasn't from the unexpected invitation, but from the mention of Howard. Clara knew that her ex-fiancé would not easily accept public humiliation. Over the past few weeks, while caring for Eagle Shadow, she had heard rumors about armed groups scouring the region, supposedly looking for hostile Indians. The older warrior, who introduced himself as Running Bear, explained in broken English that Eagle Shadow was actually the chief of the Lakota tribe. Clara felt the world spin with the revelation. All the little clues she had ignored, the way he watched the horizon with a leader's eyes, the way he spoke of his people with deep responsibility, now made sense. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, a mix of hurt and understanding in her voice. "To protect both of us," Eagle Shadow replied simply. "But now we can't hide anymore." One of the younger warriors warned of movement of horsemen approaching from the west, probably Howard's men. There was no time for hesitation. Clara quickly gathered her medical equipment and mounted her horse, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts about her family, about the consequences of her choice. The ride to the Lakota village was long and silent. They crossed prairies golden by the setting sun, crossed crystal-clear streams, and skirted imposing rock formations. Clara watched Eagle Shadow ride at the head of the group, majestic in his leader's stance, so different from the injured man she had encountered weeks ago. When they finally arrived at the village, hidden in a valley protected by mountains, Clara was greeted with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Women stopped their work to watch her, children ran to hide behind the leather tents, and warriors studied her with stern gazes. Morning Star, Eagle Shadow's younger sister, was the first to approach. With a gentle smile, she led Clara to a tent prepared especially for her. "My brother told us about your kindness," he said in surprisingly fluent English. "You saved our chief's life. Our tribe does not forget its friends." That night, sitting around the council fire, Clara listened to Eagle Shadow tell his tribe about the events of the past few weeks. She didn't understand all the Lakota words, but she could feel the weight of each one. Occasionally, their gazes met through the flames, and in those moments, everything else seemed to disappear. Running Bear, who Clara discovered was the tribe's most respected advisor, approached her after the meeting. "You are between two worlds now, young healer," he said, his voice thick with wisdom. "The path you choose will affect not only your destiny, but that of many others." The old man's words echoed in her mind as she retreated to her tent. Through the opening, he could see Eagle's shadow still sitting by the fire, his silhouette silhouetted against the flames. He carried the weight of his people on his shoulders, and now somehow their fate was intertwined with his. The next morning, Clara woke up to the sounds of commotion in the village. A young warrior had returned from Riverbrook with disturbing news. Howard Mitchell was organizing a group of armed men, claiming that the Lakota had kidnapped his bride. Her father's bank had frozen business with merchants who maintained friendly relations with the natives, and posters with Clara's face began to appear in neighboring towns. Eagle's shadow found Clara watching the horizon, her expression lost between concern and determination. "You can come back," he said softly. "Explain that she wasn't kidnapped. Maybe that would be safer." Clara turned to him, her eyes shining with a newfound certainty. "I can't go back to a life of lies," he replied. "Besides, your wound still needs care." A small smile appeared on Eagle Shadow's lips. "My wound has been healing for days," he confessed. "Then why did you let me continue the bandages?" Clara asked, although she already knew the answer in her heart. "Because every moment with you made me want to know more of your world, even though we knew our paths should remain separate." The wind blew stronger, bringing with it the scent of wild sage and the weight of decisions that would change their lives forever. On the horizon, dark clouds were forming, foreshadowing a storm, both in the sky and in their intertwined destinies. News of the alleged Lakota assault and kidnapping of Clara Thompson spread like wildfire across the region. In Riverbrook, Howard Mitchell had turned the local saloon into his makeshift headquarters, where armed men came and went carrying rifles and ammunition. Banker Richard Mitchell, her father, financed the operation that, according to them, would rescue the poor girl from the hands of the savages. In the Lakota village, Clara observed the growing movement of warriors preparing for a possible confrontation. Morning Star taught her about the traditions of her people, showing how the women of the tribe made medicines from local herbs, knowledge that fascinated Clara and complemented her Western medical training. "Our people have always known that medicine is everywhere," Morning Star explained, as he showed Clara how to make a healing poultice, in the plants, in the waters, in the wind that blows from the mountains. During these lessons, Clara often noticed Eagle Shadow's gaze on her. The Lakota chief divided his time between meetings with the tribal council and silent observations of activities at the camp. His presence caused Clara a mixture of uneasiness and comfort that she still did not fully understand. One afternoon, while Clara was helping to treat a child with a fever, Running Bear approached with worrying news. "The white men of Riverbrook have made an alliance with the Crow," said the old man, his voice deep. "They promised Lakota land in exchange for help finding you." Eagle Shadow, who was nearby, clenched his fists. The rivalry between Lakota and Crow was long-standing, and white interference only complicated an already delicate situation. "We need to prepare," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility. Clara felt the weight of guilt on her shoulders. "This is all because of me," she murmured, but Eagle Shadow held her arm gently. "No," he replied firmly. "Mitchell just uses you as an excuse. He's wanted our land for a long time. You just exposed his true intentions." That night, as the full moon bathed the camp in its silvery light, Eagle Shadow invited Clara to go for a walk. They climbed to a high point that offered a panoramic view of the valley. "My father brought me here when I became chief," he shared, his gaze lost on the horizon. "He said a leader must always see beyond what is before his eyes." Clara observed his strong profile against the starry sky. "What do you see now?" "Change," he replied after a moment of silence. "I see two worlds that can no longer remain separate, like the sun and the moon, different but eternally connected." His gaze met hers, and Clara felt her heart quicken. The closeness between them was electrifying, filled with unspoken words and feelings that defied the cultural barriers that separated them. "My people speak of a time when there were no divisions," Eagle Shadow continued, his voice soft, "when the earth had no owners and men understood the language of the spirits." "Could that time come back?" Clara asked, her voice no more than a whisper. Before he could respond, cries of alarm echoed across the valley. Torches moved in the darkness, approaching the village from the west. Eagle Shadow reacted instantly, running back to camp with Clara in pursuit. The warriors were already mounted when they arrived, their faces painted for battle. Running Bear reported that Crow Scouts had been sighted near the sacred stream, probably guiding Mitchell's men. "Take the women and children to the caves in the mountains," Eagle Shadow ordered his younger brother, White Wolf. Turning to Clara, her eyes conveyed a mixture of concern and determination. "You must go with them." "No," Clara replied firmly. "I'm a healer. I might be needed if someone gets hurt." A shadow of pride crossed Eagle Shadow's face. He knew there was no point in arguing. In recent weeks, he had learned about the willpower of this woman who defied all the conventions of her own people. Morningstar quickly organized an area for medical care, combining traditional Lakota knowledge with Clara's Western supplies. Other women from the tribe who had not left for the caves joined them, preparing bandages and medicines. The sound of gunfire cut through the night, echoing through the valley. Clara forced herself to remain calm as she treated the first wounded to arrive, both Lakota warriors and Crow raiders who had been captured. His determination to save lives made no distinction between friends and enemies. During a quiet moment, Clara heard Howard Mitchell's familiar voice echoing in the darkness. "Clara Thompson, we know she's there. These savages can't protect her forever." Eagle Shadow, who had briefly returned to check the situation at the camp, exchanged a meaningful look with Clara. At that moment, they both understood that there was no going back. Their lives were irrevocably intertwined in this fight that was bigger than themselves. "Tomorrow, when the sun rises," Eagle Shadow said softly in his ear, "our worlds will be different. But tonight, we fight for something greater than our differences." Clara nodded, understanding the weight of those words. As she wiped the blood from her hands and prepared to receive more wounded, she knew that her choice to abandon the arranged marriage had set in motion events that would change not only her life, but the fate of two conflicting cultures. The moon continued its journey across the sky, silent witness to a battle that was just the beginning of a much greater transformation. On the horizon, the first rays of dawn began to color the sky, promising a new day, and with it, even greater challenges for Clara and Eagle Shadow to face together. Dawn brought with it the heavy silence that follows battles. The Lakota camp, although wounded, remained standing, but the toll of the previous night was written on the exhausted faces of the warriors and the groans of the wounded that Clara continued to tirelessly treat. Howard Mitchell and his men had temporarily retreated, leaving behind 3 of their captured Crow allies. Eagle Shadow ordered that they be treated with dignity, a decision that surprised even some of his own warriors. Clara observed how this attitude impacted the prisoners, who clearly expected harsher treatment. "You surprised them?" she commented to Eagle Shadow as she changed the bandages of a young Lakota warrior. "They didn't expect mercy." "True strength lies not in how much blood we can shed," he replied, his eyes weary but determined, "but in how much we can spare." Running Bear convened the tribal council that morning, and for the first time, Clara was invited to participate. Sitting next to Morningstar, she listened to the discussions on how to proceed. The younger warriors advocated a preemptive attack on Riverbrook, while the elders preferred a more cautious approach. "White people have more powerful weapons," warned Running Bear, his voice thick with concern. "And now they have the law on their side. We need to be cunning like the fox, not impetuous like the young buffalo." It was then that Clara had an idea. "I can write a letter," she suggested, attracting all eyes. "To my father. He has always been fair to all people, regardless of their background. Perhaps he can help mediate this situation." Eagle Shadow considered the proposal for a few moments. "Is your father respected in Riverbrook?" "Yes," Clara nodded, "and unlike Mr. Mitchell, he has no interest in land or power. He just wants to do what is right." The decision has been made. Clara wrote a long letter explaining everything: her encounter with the injured Eagle Shadow, Howard Mitchell's true motives, and how violence would only bring more suffering to both sides. White Wolf, known for his ability to move silently, was chosen to deliver the message. While they waited for a response, Clara continued her work in the makeshift medical field. Surprisingly, one of the Crow prisoners, a young man named Swift Arrow, began to help her. He had been a healer in his own tribe, and shared with her valuable knowledge about medicinal herbs other than what Morning Star had taught. "My people and the Lakota were not always enemies," Swift Arrow explained in halting English. "Old stories tell of times when we hunted together and shared the same lands." Eagle Shadow, who was passing by at that moment, stopped to listen. "My grandfather told these stories," he confirmed. "He said it was the white man who taught us to draw lines on the earth and call them borders." The conversation was interrupted by the abrupt arrival of White Wolf. It carried not only a response from Dr. Thompson, but also alarming news. Howard Mitchell had convinced the territorial governor to send a company of cavalry to settle the Indian situation. Dr. Thompson's letter was both comforting and worrying. He expressed relief in knowing that Clara was safe and showed understanding for her choices, but warned of imminent danger. Mitchell was using his political influence to turn a personal conflict into a broader territorial issue. "We need to act before the soldiers arrive," Eagle Shadow declared during an emergency meeting, "but not through violence." To everyone's surprise, he proposed a bold plan: invite representatives from Riverbrook, including Dr. Thompson and other respectable citizens, to a peace meeting in the village. It was a risky move, but it could be the only chance to avoid greater bloodshed. "Do you trust white people that much?" questioned one of the older warriors. "I trust the wisdom that tells us that not all winds blow in the same direction," Eagle Shadow replied. "And I trust Clara's judgment of her people." The look they exchanged at that moment was loaded with meaning. Clara realized that Eagle Shadow wasn't just fighting for his people's survival, he was trying to build a bridge between two worlds, just as she had done by choosing to remain in the village. In the days that followed, preparations were made for the meeting. Morning Star taught Clara the rituals of Lakota hospitality, while Swift Arrow and the other Crow prisoners, impressed by their treatment, offered to act as mediators with their own tribe. One afternoon, while organizing medicinal herbs together, Eagle Shadow shared with Clara an ancient prophecy of his people. "The elders speak of a time when the white buffalo will bring unity among all peoples," he said softly. "Maybe we won't see that day, but we can start building the path." Clara felt her heart quicken when he gently touched her hand. "You changed more than my life when you found me that day," he continued. "It changed the way I see the future of our people." "And you changed the way I see the world," she replied, allowing her fingers to intertwine with his. "There are no longer such clear lines between us and them, for me." The sun began to set, painting the sky with colors that seemed to symbolize the mixing of their worlds: the intense red of passion, the gold of hope, and the deep blue of the challenges that were yet to come. On the horizon, a cloud of dust announced the approach of nights, and with them, the moment that would decide the fate not only of a forbidden love, but of two cultures on a collision course. The arrival of Dr. William Thompson to the Lakota village marked a decisive moment in the history of two peoples. Accompanied by three respectable citizens of Riverbrook, the Reverend Joseph Parker, the schoolmistress Martha Wilson, and the merchant Samuel Green, he crossed the invisible border that separated two worlds with the calm dignity that had always characterized him. Clara watched the group approach with her heart racing. Beside her, Eagle Shadow maintained a serene posture, although she could feel the tension in his muscles. Visitors were greeted with the traditional Lakota welcome ritual, organized by Morning Star, who had insisted on the importance of showcasing the richness of their culture. "Clara," Dr. Thompson called softly as he dismounted, his blue eyes shining with unshed tears at the sight of his daughter. She ran into his arms, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability that she hadn't allowed herself to show in weeks. "You look different," he commented, holding her by the shoulders and studying her sun-tanned face. "There is a new strength in your eyes." "I learned a lot here, Father," she replied, turning to introduce him to Eagle Shadow, who approached with the dignity befitting a leader. The meeting between the two men was a moment full of meaning. The Riverbrook doctor and the Lakota chief studied each other in silence for a few moments before exchanging a firm handshake. Clara realized that her father had noticed the same nobility in Eagle Shadow that she had discovered during their weeks together. The meeting took place in the center of the village, where a large circle had been formed. Running Bear lit the sacred pipe, explaining through Morning Star, who acted as interpreter, the meaning of the peace ritual. Reverend Parker, initially hesitant, ended up participating in the ceremony with genuine respect. "Howard Mitchell is moving forces that we cannot contain for long," Dr. Thompson explained as discussions began. "He has convinced many in Riverbrook that the Lakota are a threat to the city's expansion." "And what do you think, Dr. Thompson?" Eagle Shadow asked directly, his dark eyes fixed on the doctor. "I think the real threat comes from greed and prejudice," the doctor replied firmly. "Mitchell wants Lakota land to expand his business. Clara's supposed kidnapping is just a convenient excuse." Professor Martha Wilson, who had remained quiet until then, spoke up. "There are others in Riverbrook who think like us, people who believe there can be peace and cooperation between our people." Swift Arrow, who had been invited to the meeting along with the other Crow, offered a surprising perspective. "My people were used by Mitchell. He promised land that was not his to give. Now we see that we were foolish to trust the words of a man who does not respect even his own people." The discussion lasted for hours, with proposals and counter-proposals being presented. Samuel Green, the merchant, suggested establishing regular trade routes between Riverbrook and the Lakota village, arguing that economic ties could strengthen peace. During a break in negotiations, Clara found her father watching the sunset. "You've really found your place here, haven't you?" he asked softly. "I found more than that, Father," she replied, her gaze unconsciously seeking Eagle Shadow, who was talking to Running Bear on the other side of the camp. "I have found a purpose. Here I can be both a healer and a mediator between our people." Dr. Thompson smiled understandingly. "And found love too, I see." When Clara blushed, he continued, "Don't look at me with that surprise. I'm your father. I know your heart. And I see how you two look at each other." "You don't disapprove?" she asked hesitantly. "My dear, I have spent my life healing people without caring about the color of their skin or their beliefs. How could I disapprove when my daughter shows the same openness of heart?" The conversation was interrupted by cries of alarm. A young warrior arrived at a gallop, bearing urgent news. The cavalry was less than a day away, and Howard Mitchell was riding with them, leading a group of armed men. Tension took over the camp. Eagle Shadow quickly assembled his council, now including the visitors from Riverbrook. "We need to act quickly," declared Reverend Parker. "I can ride to the fort and speak to the commander, He is a reasonable man who might hear the truth. I'll go with you, offered Samuel Green. I have documents that prove Mitchell's shady dealings with land speculators. This could help our cause. Clara watched the frantic movement with a mix of hope and apprehension. In a few hours, the visitors would leave to try to avoid an armed confrontation, each with their own mission. Her father would stay in the village, both to be with her and to demonstrate to the military that the Lakota did not hold hostages. At dusk, as the village prepared for a tense night, Eagle Shadow found Clara near the stream where she used to gather medicinal herbs. "Your father is a wise man," he said, sitting down beside her. "Yes, he is," she replied, allowing her head to rest on his shoulder. "Eagle Shadow, what will happen to us if—" He interrupted her gently. "Among my people, there is a belief that some paths are laid out by spirits long before we are born. Our meeting on that plain was no accident." Clara intertwined her fingers with his, feeling the strength and kindness of those hands that had lived so long. "So are we going to trust the spirits?" "Let's trust ourselves," he replied, leaning down to kiss her softly. It was their first kiss, a tender moment stolen on the edge of an impending storm. The moon rose over the horizon, bathing the camp in its silvery light. Somewhere in the darkness, armed men approached, carrying with them the weight of prejudices and ambitions. But at that moment, on the banks of the Whispering Brook, two hearts beat in unison, defying the boundaries that men had drawn on the earth. Dawn arrived with tension palpable in the air. Clara awoke to the sound of distant drums. The Lakota were performing their morning rituals of protection, their deep voices echoing across the valley in ancient chants. On the other side of the camp, his father was talking to Running Bear, both of them leaning over a makeshift map of the region. Eagle Shadow emerged from his tent with the characteristic dignity of a leader, but Clara noticed the dark shadows beneath his eyes, betraying a sleepless night. He had spent hours in council with the elders, preparing for all the possibilities the day could bring. "Scouts have spotted dust on the southern horizon," Morningstar reported, approaching Clara with a cup of herbal tea. "The cavalry moves faster than we expected." Dr. Thompson joined them, his face showing concern. "Howard Mitchell managed to convince Captain Reynolds that you are holding Clara hostage. Reverend Parker and Samuel Green may not arrive in time to present the evidence against Mitchell." "Then we must prepare for the worst," Eagle Shadow declared, his voice firm as he approached the group. "Dr. Thompson, you and Clara must leave now. You can intercept the cavalry and explain the truth." "No!" Clara protested vehemently. "I will not abandon the village when they need medical help most." "Clara," her father began softly, "perhaps Eagle Shadow is right. Your presence here could be used as justification for an attack." But before they could continue their discussion, Swift Arrow ran up to them, panting. "Crow Knights approach from the east. They are not the same ones who fought us before. They are warriors from the faction that still supports Mitchell." The news fell like lightning on the camp. Eagle Shadow immediately began organizing the defense, positioning warriors at strategic points. Clara watched in admiration as he remained calm even in the face of the imminent threat of being attacked from two sides. "We need a distraction," Running Bear suggested, his experienced eyes assessing the terrain. "Something that will give us time until Reverend Parker arrives." That's when Clara had a bold idea. "What if I rode into the cavalry?" she proposed. "Not alone, but escorted by Lakota warriors and accompanied by my father. It would be a clear demonstration that I am not a hostage." Eagle Shadow considered the proposal for a moment, his eyes meeting hers with intensity. "It's risky," he said finally. "Mitchell will be there, and he won't take it easy to see his plans destroyed. More risk is waiting for them to completely surround us," Clara argued. "Besides, Captain Reynolds has a reputation for being a fair man. If we can talk to him before Mitchell completely influences him—" The argument was interrupted by the sound of distant gunfire. The Crow had begun exchanging fire with Lakota scouts in the eastern hills. There was no more time for long deliberations. "Go," Eagle Shadow decided, his voice thick with restrained emotion. "Take White Wolf and 4 of our best warriors, but promise me that if things go wrong, you will ride away without looking back." Clara held his face in her hands, ignoring the surprised looks from the others. "I won't make promises I can't keep," she replied softly. "My destiny is tied to yours now, whatever it may be." Dr. Thompson watched the scene with a mix of concern and understanding. He recognized in his daughter's eyes the same determination that his late wife used to show, a strength that no logical argument could bend. Within minutes, the small group was assembled and ready to go. Morning Star hugged Clara tightly, whispering an ancient Lakota blessing in her ear. Swift Arrow offered to guide them along a safe path that would avoid the Crow warriors. Before they left, Eagle Shadow approached Clara's horse. Wordlessly, he strapped a small medicine pouch to his saddle, a sacred amulet that Lakota healers carried for protection. The gesture, more eloquent than any statement, made Clara's heart quicken. The ride towards the cavalry was tense, each meter covered filled with possibilities both promising and devastating. Dr. Thompson rode alongside his daughter, occasionally giving her looks of pride mixed with apprehension. "You really love him, don't you?" he asked during a brief pause to check his direction. "More than I thought possible to love someone," Clara answered honestly. "And not just him, Father. I learned to love his people, his traditions, his way of seeing the world. It's as if all my life I've only been seeing half the truth." White Wolf, who was riding in front, raised his arm signaling that they had spotted the cavalry. On the horizon, a cloud of dust revealed the approach of dozens of horsemen, their blue uniforms beginning to become visible. "Remember," Dr. Thompson said, as they prepared for the meeting, "Captain Reynolds may be a military man, but first and foremost, he is a man of principle. Speak from the heart, Clara. Sometimes the simplest truth is the most powerful weapon." Clara sat up straighter in the saddle, feeling the weight of Eagle Shadow's amulet against her leg. On the horizon, the sun began its descent towards the mountains, painting the sky with shades of gold and crimson. It was as if nature itself was waiting to see what destiny would be written on the plains of Wyoming that afternoon, whether it would be one of unity or further division, of understanding or conflict. With a deep breath, she guided her horse forward, knowing that the next few moments could change not only her future, but that of 2 cultures that had so long seen each other through the veil of fear and prejudice. The amulet on her saddle seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, reminding her that no matter the outcome, her heart had already chosen its path. The tension was palpable as Clara, her father, and the small Lakota escort approached the cavalry. Captain Reynolds, a middle-aged man with a rigid posture and experienced eyes, raised his hand ordering his troops to stop. At his side, Howard Mitchell could barely contain his fury at seeing Clara riding freely alongside the native warriors. "Miss Thompson," Captain Reynolds greeted her formally, his eyes assessing the situation with professional caution. "It's a relief to find her alive." "Captain," Clara replied firmly, "there is no need for rescue. I am here of my own free will, just like my father." Howard Mitchell spurred his horse forward a few steps. "She is clearly under the influence of these savages. Look at how she dresses, how she talks. They have completely corrupted her." "Mr. Mitchell," Dr. Thompson interjected, his voice calm but authoritative, "I suggest you choose your words more carefully. My daughter is in full command of her mental faculties." White Wolf and the other warriors remained impassive, although Clara could feel the tension in their postures. Eagle Shadow's amulet seemed to burn against her leg, reminding her of what was at stake. "Captain Reynolds," Clara continued, "what you were told about a kidnapping is a lie. Mr. Mitchell is using this story to justify an invasion of Lakota land. The captain frowned, his gaze switching between Clara and Mitchell. These are serious accusations, miss. Do you have proof of what you say? At this moment, the sound of thundering hooves caught everyone's attention. Samuel Green and Reverend Parker appeared on the horizon, riding at full speed. In his hands, documents that would prove the true nature of Mitchell's ambitions. "Too late!" Howard suddenly shouted, pulling out his gun. "I will not allow a hysterical woman and a bunch of savages to destroy everything I have built." Chaos ensued within seconds. White Wolf moved his horse to protect Clara, while confused soldiers tried to decide how to react. Dr. Thompson positioned himself between his daughter and Mitchell, his voice thundering, "Put that gun down, Howard! You've done enough damage!" Captain Reynolds drew his own gun, pointing it at Mitchell. "Mr. Mitchell, you are threatening civilians in the presence of Army officers. I suggest you reconsider your actions." Samuel Green and Reverend Parker finally reached the group, panting. "Captain," Green called, "we have documents here proving fraud in land negotiations. Mitchell has deceived both settlers and natives." The tension reached its peak when a shot echoed across the plain, but it was not coming from the assembled group. From the east, Crow warriors began to emerge, taking advantage of the confusion to launch their attack. "It's a trap!" Howard yelled, trying to incite chaos. "No!" Clara responded forcefully. "The approaching Crow are your allies, Mr. Mitchell. You manipulated them as much as you tried to manipulate us all." Captain Reynolds quickly took control of the situation, ordering his men to form a defensive perimeter. Clara watched in awe as White Wolf and the Lakota warriors, without hesitation, positioned themselves alongside the soldiers, ready to defend those they, until moments before, considered enemies. "Captain," Clara pleaded, "we need to stop this bloodshed. There are women and children in the Lakota village, and the Crow are also being used in a war that isn't theirs." Reynolds studied the situation for a moment before making his decision. "Lieutenant Williams, arrest Mr. Mitchell. Dr. Thompson, we will need your medical services. As for the rest of us, we have a village to protect." Howard Mitchell was disarmed and restrained, his protests lost in the wind as Samuel Green handed the incriminating documents to the captain. Reverend Parker volunteered to ride to the Crows with a white flag, hoping to establish dialogue before more blood was shed. Clara felt her heart break between riding back to the village to alert Eagle Shadow and staying to help with the negotiations. White Wolf seemed to realize his dilemma. "Go," he said in his limited English. "Eagle Shadow needs to know. We protect here." With a nod of agreement from Captain Reynolds, Clara spurred her horse towards the village. The wind whipped his face as he rode, carrying with him the hope that this day would not end in tragedy. As she approached the camp, she saw Eagle Shadow organizing the defense along with Running Bear. Their eyes met from a distance, and Clara could see the relief on his face when he recognized her. "The cavalry is on our side," she announced bluntly as she dismounted. Mitchell was arrested, and Captain Reynolds offered protection to the village. Running Bear translated the news to the nearby warriors, a wave of hopeful murmurs spreading through the camp. Eagle Shadow approached Clara, his hands gently holding hers. "You achieved the impossible," he said softly. "He built a bridge where everyone only saw an abyss." "No," she replied, shaking his hands. "We built it. All of us who refuse to accept that hate is the only way." Morning Star rushed over, bringing news of the scouts. The Crows had accepted Reverend Parker into Parliament. Apparently, the revelation of Mitchell's manipulation had shaken his confidence in the cause. The sun was beginning to set when Captain Reynolds arrived at the village with his troop, accompanied by Dr. Thompson and the others. Clara watched with suppressed emotion as soldiers and Lakota warriors worked side by side to establish a secure perimeter, while Reverend Parker and Running Bear mediated conversations with the Crow representatives. "There's still a lot of work to do," Eagle Shadow commented, watching the movement. "Many old wounds to heal, much mistrust to overcome." "But today we took the first step," Clara replied, feeling the weight of the amulet on her saddle as a reminder of the path they had chosen. "And tomorrow we will give another, and then another." Twilight painted the sky with colors that seemed to symbolize the mixture of their cultures, the red of spilled blood, the gold of reborn hope, and the deep blue of promises not yet fulfilled. In the Lakota village, as fires were lit and stories began to be shared between former enemies, the possibility of a different future was born. Clara Thompson, the young woman who had abandoned her arranged marriage to follow her heart, was now at the center of a transformation greater than she had ever imagined. By his side, Eagle Shadow represented not only his love, but the promise that true hearts could, in fact, build bridges across history's deepest chasms. Dawn brought a different atmosphere to the Lakota village. Where there had once been tension and distrust, now cavalry soldiers and native warriors shared stories around campfires that still burned from the night before. Clara watched the scene with a mixture of hope and caution, knowing that peace was still fragile like crystal. Captain Reynolds had established his camp near the village, a decision that demonstrated both protection and respect for Lakota sovereignty. Eagle Shadow, in turn, had assigned Morning Star and other members of the tribe to assist in communication between the two groups, building bridges of understanding word for word. "It's strange to see blue uniforms in our land without blood," commented Running Bear, approaching Clara as she organized her medical supplies. "But perhaps the spirits are showing us a new path." Clara smiled, remembering how the old man initially viewed her with suspicion. People can surprise each other when they have the chance to really get to know each other. The day promised to be busy. Crow representatives would arrive to continue the negotiations begun the night before, and Clara knew that their presence would be essential as a mediator. Her knowledge of both cultures and her unique position as the daughter of the respected Dr. Thompson made her a living bridge between worlds. Eagle Shadow found her preparing medicinal herbs with Swift Arrow, who had become a valuable ally. "The elders want to hold a ceremony tonight," he informed, his eyes shining with a special purpose. "A bonding ceremony." Clara looked up, surprised. "Union between the tribes?" "That too," he replied with a small smile, "but mainly a union between two hearts that the spirits chose to show the way." Clara's heart quickened as she understood the meaning of his words. Eagle Shadow was proposing marriage, not just as a personal union, but as a symbol of hope for everyone. "Did the elders approve?" she asked, knowing the weight of tribal traditions. "Running Bear said the spirits already brought us together the moment you chose to save me on that plane. The ceremony will only confirm what is already written in the stars." The news spread quickly through the camp. Dr. Thompson, upon learning of the proposal, sought out his daughter with tears in his eyes. "Your mother always said you had a different destiny," he said, hugging her. "Now I see she was right." Captain Reynolds, demonstrating political sensitivity, offered his official blessing to the Union, recognizing its symbolic importance for white-native relations. "Maybe that's what this territory needs," he commented. "Not just paper treaties, but true bonds between people." Preparation for the ceremony mobilized the entire village. Morning Star and other Lakota women helped Clara prepare, dressing her in traditional clothing carefully decorated with beads and feathers. Every detail carried meaning, each color a prayer to the spirits. Meanwhile, in the makeshift prison at the military camp, Howard Mitchell seethed with rage upon learning of the events. "This is an abomination," he shouted to anyone who would listen. "Clara Thompson is throwing away her future, tarnishing her family name." But his words fell on deaf ears. The Riverbrook community, represented by Reverend Parker and other citizens who had arrived to witness the negotiations, began to see the Union as a symbol of hope for the future of the territory. In the afternoon, Crow representatives arrived, led by a respected chief named Lone Hawk. To the surprise of many, they brought traditional gifts for the bride and groom, a gesture of peace and reconciliation that moved even the most skeptical. "Our people also have stories," Lone Hawk said during the council, "of times when love was stronger than borders. Perhaps it is time to remember those stories again." As the sun began its descent over the horizon, Clara found a moment of solitude near the sacred stream. Eagle Shadow found her there, respecting the custom of not seeing the bride before the ceremony, but needing to share important words. "My people have a saying," he said, keeping a respectful distance. "When two rivers meet, they don't ask where the other came from. They simply flow together toward the future." Clara felt tears of happiness in her eyes. "And when the waters mix, there is no way to separate them." The ceremony began at sunset, with the entire valley appearing to bow in reverence at the sacred moment. Running Bear led traditional Lakota rituals, while Reverend Parker offered Christian blessings, creating a unique harmony between the two faiths. Cavalry soldiers, Lakota and Crow warriors, Riverbrook settlers, and tribesmen all stood in a circle around the bride and groom, witnessing not only the union of two hearts, but the birth of a new way of living together. Firelight danced on the faces of those present as Clara and Eagle Shadow exchanged promises in both languages, each word a bridge between worlds. Morning Star translated ancient blessings, her voice carrying the wisdom of generations. "May your steps always be together," intoned Running Bear in Lakota, "like the sun and moon that share the same sky. May your love be an example," added Reverend Parker, "that the heart knows no bounds." When Eagle Shadow and Clara sealed their union with a kiss, the entire valley seemed to vibrate with an energy old and new at the same time. It was as if the spirits of the ancestors were present, blessing not only the couple, but the future that their union represented. The celebration that followed was a unique blend of traditions. Lakota songs mingled with settlers' fiddles, traditional dances were learned and shared, and stories were told in multiple languages around campfires. Clara, now wearing both Lakota symbols and her mother's necklace, watched the scene with an overflowing heart. By his side, Eagle Shadow exuded a serenity that infected everyone. Together they had proven that love could be stronger than generations of fear and prejudice. The night progressed with promises of a new dawn, not just for the couple, but for everyone who witnessed that historic moment on the plains of Wyoming. A new story was beginning, written not in blood and hate, but in understanding and hope. The first rays of the sun found Clara and Eagle Shadow sitting together at the entrance to their new tent, watching the gradual transformation taking place in the village. 2 weeks had passed since the wedding ceremony, and the camp had become a living symbol of peaceful coexistence between cultures. Captain Reynolds had kept his word, establishing a discreet military presence that served more as a diplomatic bridge than an occupation force. His men had learned to respect Lakota customs, while the tribe's warriors began to understand that not all blue uniforms brought destruction. "I never imagined seeing anything like this," Clara commented, leaning against her husband's shoulder as she watched a group of young soldiers learning tracking techniques from Lakota warriors. "It's as if we are witnessing the birth of a new world." Eagle Shadow smiled, though his eyes maintained the seriousness of a leader who knew both the promises and perils of change. "Seeds need time to grow," he replied, "and we must protect them from strong winds." The winds he was referring to were not just metaphorical. News from Riverbrook indicated that Howard Mitchell, even in prison, still maintained considerable influence. Their allies pressured the territorial government, arguing that the military presence among the Lakota was a waste of resources that should be directed to protecting the true interests of the settlers. Dr. Thompson, who divided his time between the village and Riverbrook, regularly brought updates on the political situation. That morning, he arrived with a worried expression, immediately looking for Clara and Eagle Shadow. "Mitchell Bank is canceling loans from farmers who show sympathy for the Lakota cause," he reported during a private meeting. "They are trying to force an economic confrontation since the military has failed." Running Bear, who was participating in the conversation, nodded gravely. "Snakes don't always attack with exposed fangs," he commented. "Sometimes the poison is more subtle." Clara felt her heart sink as she thought about the families who could lose everything due to greed and prejudice. "There must be something we can do," she said, her mind already racing with possibilities. It was Morning Star who offered the first practical suggestion. "Our people have always practiced trade," she recalled, "furs, crafts, knowledge of medicinal herbs. Why not establish direct trade routes with the colonists who support us?" The idea quickly gained traction. Samuel Green, who had remained in the region to assist in the negotiations, offered his trading post as a neutral point for exchanges. Captain Reynolds, recognizing the importance of establishing stable economic ties, assigned a small escort to ensure the safety of the trade caravans. "It's more than commerce," Eagle Shadow explained during a tribal council meeting. "It's a way to show that our people can thrive together, not just survive apart." The following days were of intense activity. Clara, combining her Western medical knowledge with Lakota healing practices, began preparing a line of natural medicines that soon became sought after in Riverbrook and surrounding towns. Morning Star organized a group of artisans to produce items that blended traditional techniques with settler tastes. The success of these initiatives has not gone unnoticed. Other merchants, seeing the prosperity generated by cooperation, began to openly challenge the Mitchells' monopoly. Reverend Parker, in his Sunday sermons, talked about how Clara and Eagle Shadow's marriage represented the possibility of redemption and unity among peoples. But not everything was victories. One night, a group of drunken young men, incited by Mitchell's allies, attempted to set fire to Green's trading post. They were prevented by the quick joint action of Lakota warriors and cavalry soldiers, but the incident served as a reminder of the fragility of peace. "Some hearts take longer to change," Eagle Shadow commented as he inspected the damage with Clara. "But every act of violence we prevent is a victory for both sides." Clara watched her husband with admiration. In moments like these, she saw clearly why he was such a respected leader. His ability to remain calm and seek peaceful solutions, even in the face of provocation, inspired others to follow his example. The arrival of winter brought new challenges and opportunities. Colonist families who had lost financial support from the Mitchells faced difficulties preparing for the cold season. In response, the Lakota tribe offered to share food preservation and shelter techniques they had developed over generations. "See," Running Bear said during one of these knowledge-sharing sessions, "how the spirits guide us to wisdom through difficulties. The cold that could separate us ends up bringing us closer together." Clara, now fluent in Lakota and respected both as a healer and cultural mediator, often reflected on how her decision to abandon her arranged marriage had triggered such profound changes. In their nightly conversations with Eagle Shadow, they planned the future not only for themselves, but for generations to come. "Our children will grow up knowing the best of both worlds," she said one night, as they organized medical supplies together. "They won't have to choose between cultures or hide who they are." Eagle Shadow touched his face gently. "And through them, others will learn that true power is not in dominating or excluding, but in understanding and accepting." The news that Clara was expecting a child, confirmed both by traditional Lakota signs and her medical knowledge, spread through the village as a symbol of hope. Running Bear declared that the child would be a gift from the spirits, born to build bridges between worlds. As winter approached, bringing with it icy winds from the mountains, the Lakota village and its allies in Riverbrook continued their work of building a different future. Each small success, each new understanding between cultures, each conflict avoided through dialogue, was a seed planted in soil previously considered sterile. Clara and Eagle Shadow, united not just by love, but by a shared vision of possibilities, knew their work was just beginning. The road ahead would still be challenging, but the foundations of a new way of living were already firmly established on the plains of Wyoming. Spring has arrived on the plains of Wyoming, bringing with it not only the blooming of wildflowers, but also the promise of a new beginning. Clara, now with her belly visible under her dresses, adapted to the Lakota style, watched from the top of a hill the changes that spread across the valley like waves in a lake. Samuel Green's trading post had expanded, becoming a thriving trading center where colonists and natives traded on equal terms. The medications she had developed, combining Western and Lakota knowledge, were now sought after even in distant cities. Morning Star had established a school where children from both cultures learned together, preserving both English and the Lakota language. "The spirits were right," said Running Bear, approaching Clara with his serene gait. "You and Eagle Shadow are like the sun and the moon, different but essential to each other and to the balance of the world." Clara smiled, remembering the frightened young woman who had abandoned her arranged marriage a year ago. How much had changed since then? She was no longer just the daughter of the Riverbrook doctor, nor just the wife of the Lakota chief. She was a living bridge between two worlds, just like the child growing in her womb. Eagle Shadow found them on the hill, his eyes shining with the same love and determination that Clara had first seen in that abandoned cabin. "Howard Mitchell will be released tomorrow," he informed, his voice calm but alert. "Captain Reynolds warned me." The news was not unexpected, but it still caused a wave of concern. Mitchell had spent the last few months in territorial prison, but his allies never stopped plotting. The bank, now run by his cousin, continued to put economic pressure on those who supported cooperation with the Lakota. "He doesn't have the same power anymore," Clara replied, although her hand instinctively protected her belly. "People saw that there is a better way." As if to confirm his words, a caravan of traders crossed the valley below, escorted jointly by Lakota warriors and cavalry soldiers. It was a vision that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. Dr. Thompson, who had become a respected figure in both the village and Riverbrook, arrived on horseback bringing news from the town. "The city council voted in favor of the cooperation treaty," he announced with a smile. "Lakota lands will be officially recognized and protected." The news was received with jubilation in the village. Years of struggle and uncertainty finally bore fruit. Eagle Shadow gathered the tribal council to discuss the details of the agreement, while Clara and Morning Star organized a celebration that would unite the traditions of both peoples. During the preparations, Swift Arrow, who had become a valued friend and ally, brought troubling information. "Mitchell has been seen talking to former Crow partners," he warned. "Some say he plans one last revenge before heading east." Eagle Shadow listened to the warning with the seriousness it deserved, but his response surprised everyone. "Invite him to the celebration." "What?" Clara asked, shocked. "After everything he's done?" "Sometimes the only way to disarm an enemy is to offer them peace," Eagle Shadow explained, his eyes meeting hers gently. "His hatred comes from fear and ignorance. Maybe, seeing what we've built here, he'll finally understand." The celebration was scheduled for the following night, coinciding with the full moon. Representatives from all the nearby communities were invited: settlers, military personnel, traders, and even a Crow delegation that had broken with Mitchell's allies. To everyone's surprise, Howard Mitchell showed up. He was thinner and grayer, prison having taken its toll. His eyes, once filled with arrogance, now carried a barely concealed bitterness. Clara, with Eagle's shadow by her side, approached him with dignity. "Welcome, Mr. Mitchell," she said simply. Mitchell observed the change evident in what should have been his wife, the haughty bearing, the harmonious blend of elements of both cultures in her clothes, the calm confidence in her gaze. Even more impressive was the way everyone there, white and native, treated her with equal respect. "You could have been the lady of the most important bank in the territory," he commented bitterly. "Instead, it became something much bigger," Dr. Thompson interjected, approaching the group. "She became a symbol of hope." The celebration continued into the night, traditional Lakota dances mixed with settler waltzes. Stories were shared in different languages. Children played together, oblivious to the divisions that once seemed insurmountable. Mitchell only stayed briefly, but his expression as he left was different. Something of what he had seen there, perhaps the prosperity brought about by cooperation or the genuine happiness on everyone's faces, seemed to affect him deeply. The next morning it was learned that he had left for the East, selling his local properties to a consortium of merchants in favor of the new policy of cooperation. Weeks later, Clara gave birth to a baby girl under the light of the full moon. The child, who was named Dawn Star, had the striking features of Eagle Shadow and the clear eyes of Clara. Running Bear declared her to be the embodiment of unity among people, a gift from the spirits to seal the new era of peace. On a quiet afternoon, while breastfeeding her daughter at the entrance to the tent, Clara watched the movement in the valley that was now truly a home for everyone. Eagle Shadow sat beside her, his strong arm wrapping around her protectively. "When I walked out of my marriage that day," she reflected, "I thought I was just following my heart. I didn't realize I was following a path set by the spirits." "The ways of the heart and spirits are the same," Eagle Shadow replied wisely. "We just need to have the courage to follow them." The sun was setting on the Wyoming horizon, painting the sky with colors that seemed to celebrate the union of two worlds. In the village that was now a symbol of hope for the entire land, Clara Thompson, healer, wife, mother, and bridge builder, finally understood that sometimes you have to abandon a familiar path to discover a greater destiny. Dawn Star fell asleep in his arms, her small face as serene as the future her parents had helped build. In the valley below, campfires were beginning to light, and voices in English and Lakota mingled in the night breeze, singing old and new stories of a people who had finally learned to walk together.